Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and the Harvard Classics Volume Lectures from volume number 4. This is the Milton volume, and we now turn to lecture number 34, Samson Agonistes. Welcome. This is our final text from volume 4. We've been speaking for quite some time about Milton. Hey, I recommend that if you haven't watched my earlier lectures and you stumbled onto this lecture, that you might want to go to my website, learnstrong.net. Go down that left-hand side and find there the information about Harvard Classics lectures. For sure, I would study all of the Milton lectures preceding to this one if you really want to kind of have a full understanding of the game that we'll be playing here with Milton's Samson Agonistes, the last of his texts. Our work with Milton now does come to a close with his final work of 1671. Some debate has been had, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of the dates of publishing versus the dates of writing. We want to emphasize, however, in this lecture, what I think is so significant and important about why we should still study Milton as students. I'm going to call it the symphonic Milton, just to remind you that Milton's father was an amateur musician, and Milton, I believe, was very influenced by the ideas of music, harmonics, and here we're going to see him as symphonic. There's so many things, for example, that one needs to know to be able to really appreciate Samson Agonistes. You need a background, for example, we're going to cover all of this real briefly. You need a background in Jewish history. The time of the judges, for example, around the Iron Age, roughly 1200 BCE. You need to know something about the story of Samson from the Old Testament, as Christians call that, set of documents from Judges 13 through 16. We've got to review that story if we want to make sure we understand that. You got to know something about Aristotle and Aristotelian poetics. We've given lectures already on poetics before. Think about this. Samson, we know, is the character from the Judges 13 through 16 story. But what is this Agonistes thing about? It, of course, is a Greek word which means contender or fighter. But think about the relationship between the word Agonistes and the word protagonist or antagonist. You got to know your poetics, and we'll have something to say about that. Of course, if you're talking poetics, you're talking about Aristotelian understandings of Greek tragedy. We think, of course, of Sophocles and Oedipus Rex as well as Antigone. Think about, for example, Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. There's all kinds of referencing that's going to go on here. Also, to understand both the last two titles that Milton will create, Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes, we need to read these as finally, as we said in earlier lectures over Paradise Regained, some kind of understanding of his own autobiographic attempts to come to some sense of what's going on. For example, I'm going to make the argument that when you put Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes together, you're going to see that we move from temple to temple. I'll explain more kind of what that means here in a while. We've got questions that are philosophic about theodicy and justice. We've got views from Milton's own biography about the patriarchy and his misogynistic understandings of women and the representation of the ways that so much of what Milton has said had a powerful influence on the ways men thought about women. Of course, Milton didn't invent this project, as Chaucer's Wife of Bath points out, who wrote the book called the Bible and all those stories about where women are responsible for the downfall of men, right? What the Wife of Bath says, right, let women tell those stories. We talked about that earlier. We'll come back to it. Of course, Milton has failed politician and revolutionary. We're going to see some of this. Finally, that contest, if you can call it that, a relationship between fathers and sons. I mean, we're going to see fathers and sons here in Manoah and Samson. We're going to have, of course, Milton and his own father, and we'll have a few other fathers and sons to comment as well about. Of course, we've already known this one from our study of Paradise Lost, and of course, Paradise Regained, the Father, God, and the Son, Christ. As we leave Milton, let's enjoy one last time together all the ways that Milton can blow our mind. I really mean this when I say that if these texts mean anything, they mean something to us because they move us still. And I hope that we can continue to enjoy learning. Remember, we define learning as connecting new information to old information. In many ways, Milton is our prime example of what it means to do that and how that looks. Of course, we're also going to read at our 3 levels. What does this text say? What does the text mean? Here we'll divide into 2A, themes, messages, 2B, rhetoric, and then finally, how can I relate to the text? First of all, at 3A, to other texts and to the world, and then finally at 3B, to myself. And this is, of course, the key in my estimation. It was from Milton as well, and I've said this in earlier lectures, but I'll say it now again. Learning to read Milton, it's the Everest in many ways of English poetry, but learning to read Milton will improve you as well as us as both readers and thinkers, and that's significant. Let's turn now to the first of those things that I said you kind of need to know if you're going to have any real appreciation of Samson Agonistes, because Milton assumes that you know something about Jewish Old Testament history, and without this knowledge, much is going to be lost on us. I've said this in other lectures, and I'm just going to review this very briefly. I would take some notes here, and you can work through this on your own. You can obviously Google any of this information as I raise maybe potential questions for you. I've often said that to read the Old Testament, and the Bible is a text that I assign every year, of course, to you guys for a lot of reasons. I think studying Milton is self-evident now about why. It's really kind of a geographic dance in many ways that moves from the west to the east, from the east to the west, from the north to the south, from the west back to the east and then back again. The true history starts for really our study, not with the creation of the world and all of that, but rather with Abraham in this area called Ur, that is to say present-day Iraq, Babylon. He's called by God to the east to what's going to be termed the Promised Land. There he will have 2 sons, Isaac, who will of course be the father of the nation of people known as the Hebrews or the Jews, and Ishmael, who will be the father, of course, of the Arab peoples. These are God's people too, but they are often referenced as the foreign or the other in the Hebrew Bible. From Jacob, of course, from Esau, the son of Abraham, we have 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older, but is robbed out of his birthright by Jacob. And then it will be Jacob who will produce those 12 sons, who later will be known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, ultimately they will find themselves in Egypt. The story of Joseph here comes to mind as the great liberator. But a new Pharaoh came, the opening lines of the book of Exodus, came to the throne who knew not Joseph. And then you have the 400 years of slavery. Roughly about 1250 or so BCE, historians have difficulty sometimes dating these events because we don't have a lot of extra-biblical kinds of referencing. Of course, that slavery of 400 years will lead to the rise of the great liberator, Moses, who's referenced right away as that shepherd in the invocation lines of Paradise Lost. The Exodus then leads to 40 years in the wilderness. We think of Paradise Regained in Christ's 40 days of going without food. To Mount Sinai, of course, the giving of the 10 Commandments and the tabernacle out as they're wandering in the wilderness where God's presence resides. Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land. He will designate Joshua to do so, and you have the conquering of the promised land as they cross the river Jordan. Of course, as we've commented before already in Joshua 10 and 11 as classic examples, you have lots and lots of slaughtering of people's innocence. Many have referenced this as innocence going on if the fall of Jericho comes to mind. And around 1200 BCE, we have the time of the judges. Now this will be significant to our study of Samson Agonistes. The judges are going to be these leaders that come up. And then finally we get to the time of the kings, the 3 kings, Saul and of course David, the greatest king, roughly around 1000 BCE. And he will move the location of political power to Jerusalem. That's a big deal. And then his son Solomon will build the temple, and that's a big deal because the temple is where God now resides, in the inter-holy sanctuary, Holy of Holies. And 922, after the death of Solomon, because his sons are in disputants, we have what's called the divided kingdom. To the north, you have the 10 tribes, usually referred to as Israel, and to the south, the 2 tribes that are referred to as Judah. And in 722, the Assyrian exile will happen, and they will take away those 10 tribes. Those are the 10 lost tribes that are referenced, by the way, in Paradise Regained. And then later in 586, 587, 586, we have the Babylonian exile from 587 to 538. Now, what makes this significant is because scholars believe that it's during this time that a lot of the texts of the Old Testament Torah are redacted and composed and brought together, which, by the way, will explain why. When you look at Genesis 1 and the creation cosmogonic stories that we talked about earlier, you're going to see a lot of interesting kind of permeations from Babylonian mythologies as well. In other words, there's some kind of give and take there. Of course, you need to understand this history to be able to read, for example, a psalm like 137, and we've lectured on this elsewhere. By 539, Cyrus and the Persians will allow for the return home, the rebuilding of the walls at Jerusalem, and then finally in 515 you have the new temple and what are often referred to as the Ezra reforms. Now, all of that is significant, because all of that is assumed knowledge by Milton as we get ready to study Samson Agonistes. Why? Well, because it's the time of the Judges, and the Samson story is couched in that, in more particularly the book called the Judges, chapters 13 through 16. So let's go ahead now quickly and just outline the story. Instead of reading it to you, let's just quickly outline and identify what happens in this story. I'm going to work very quickly now. I recommend, if you haven't read this story, just pause for a moment, the lecture here. Go and find the text online or in a Bible that you might possess, and then just read it, and then you can come back, and then my outlining of this will make a lot more sense. Let's go ahead and point out that Milton is going to love the idea of the suffering that is so propedeutic. You'll remember that Christ, before he is crucified in the garden, says, "Let this cup pass from me, not my will but thine be done," referenced, of course, in Paradise Regained. Suffering is going to be a big deal for Milton, and now we're going to get to a story about suffering and Samson Agonistes. But who is this Samson character? Well, if you turn to the book of Judges in the Old Testament, chapter 13 through 16, you'll hear an opening line that is kind of a refrain. Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and for that there's a certain kind of punishment. 40 years, we're told, notice the importance of 40, right? To the Philistines, who are then going to be a seafaring people. Some scholars think maybe from Crete, roughly, as we've said, 12th century. And we're told about Manoah. Notice the name is an interesting one. Man and Noah combined. Manoah and his wife, an angel, that is to say a theophany, is going to appear, and she is going to say, "You will have a son, and he will take the Nazirite vow." We can learn about this in Numbers 6, 1 through 21. No drinking of wine, not supposed to cut the hair. Anybody could do this kind of Nazirite vow, but it was obviously kind of an important moment here, because the prediction is this person who's born, Samson, will be a deliverer. This will, of course, be a permeation of a theme that we're going to hear, culminating, of course, with Mary being told that her son will be the Messiah. It's an interesting storyline, because the angel is the father, possibly, of Samson himself. That's why Samson is so strong. The similarities here, again, are referencing between the angel coming to Mary and Christ. Manoah will ask, in fact, this angel, "What is your name?" in 13:17, and will be told, "Don't ask, it's too wonderful." There will be a sacrifice. The angel goes up to heaven in flames in verse 22, and "We have seen God," is what Manoah will say. This is a special child, right? Like Christ, and we'll get to this later, temple to temple, as we've said it, and of course like Milton, who was also a very special child. Milton clearly identified with the notion of precocious children and precocious and important and informed special people, right, who have a purpose. Samson is related to the Hebrew word, by the way, for son in verse 25. The Spirit of the Lord stirred him, and in chapter 14, Samson is now grown. He goes to a place called Timah, and there he meets a Philistine woman. She is a foreigner. He says to his parents, "I want her." His parents say it's a bad idea. Genesis 24:4 and 28:1 through 2 suggests that this has always been one of the big challenges. When the children of Israel were in exile in 586 in Babylon, there was always this question about, can we explain why this happened to us? We were once this great and amazing and mighty people. One of the answers that is clearly a part of how those texts were redacted and put together was that there was this problem for the Israelite men who kept taking women who were foreigners. And of course, there's all kinds of reforms that we call those Ezra reforms, when foreign women are to be put away. We're going to see this motif here in this story as well. At 14:4 of Judges, we're told that this idea of him marrying this woman is from God. In other words, God uses bad decisions to his own advantage. And then down to Timnah, Samson will go with his parents, and alone he kills a lion barehanded, 14:5 through 6. But he doesn't tell his parents about it. And later when he comes back, in the lion's carcass, he sees honey and bees inside, and he eats the honey and he shares it with his parents. He violates his Nazirite vow and doesn't tell them about it. At Samson's wedding, then, he produces a riddle with a bet to go with it at 14:14. Out of the eater came something sweet to eat. Out of the strong, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And Samson bets some men that if they can't get the answer, then they got to pay him a whole bunch of stuff, and they can't get the answer, and so they come to his wife and say, hey, you better find out what the answer is, or we're going to kill you. 7 days she nags him, she tells the men. This is, of course, the first act of several acts of betrayal, which sets up the famous, of course, Delilah betrayal that we're going to hear about. Samson is upset because the men, of course, know now the riddle. He goes out and just kills 30 men, robs them of their stuff, and the wife and gives the stuff. And the wife, he leaves, and his wife then sleeps with his best friend, or is given to his best friend, however you want to read these lines. Chapter 15, he goes back to his wife. Her father says no. This leads to some retribution. And we've got this kind of thing set up where Samson is going to wreak revenge, an eye for an eye, and the cycle of revenge will begin to happen. He catches 300 foxes. He ties their tails together. He sets them on fire and sets them loose through the grain fields, destroys a bunch of grain. At verse 6 of chapter 15, the Philistines in retribution kill his wife and her father, burning them alive. This is some violent stuff that probably you don't read about in a Sunday school class, right? Samson comes back and kills them, quote unquote, hip and thigh, total destruction. 3,000 men of Judah then will come to Samson and say, what have you done? Samson will basically make the argument of an eye for an eye in 15:13. They will tie him up and give him over to the Philistines. It's an act of betrayal, but Samson makes them promise they won't kill him. He then will use the jawbone of a donkey or an ass, and he kills 1,000 men in 15:15. And then God gives him water out of a rock, which reminds us of the Exodus 17 story and the Numbers 20 story of course, Moses in the wilderness. By 15:20, then, we are told Samson is the judge of Israel for 20 years. But in chapter 16, which is going to be pivotal for our story, he goes to Gaza, a town. He sleeps with a prostitute. Samson's always having these problems with women. They try to ambush him. He removes the city gates, and Gaza is interesting because here he's going to escape here, but later he'll be caught with Delilah. In verse 4, we're told that he falls in love with Delilah. The Bible never mentions that he actually marries, but this nonetheless is going to be the way that Milton will tell the story. The name Delilah, by the way, does possibly mean flirt in the ancient language. The lords will come to Delilah and say, we need you to find out what it is that makes him strong, and we'll give you a lot of money for it. She asks Samson 3 times. 3 times he lies to her, and he's just too stupid or whatever to figure out that she's trying to figure out a way to subdue him. You can't help but kind of laugh at the stupidity or the incredulity or the credulity of Samson. She says it in verse 15, you don't love me, and she nags him. And finally he tells her. He sleeps in her lap at verse 19. And it's interesting, many people assume that she's the one that cuts the hair. She doesn't. She lets somebody else come in. His hair is shaved, and when his hair is shaved, he loses his strength. and verse 20 we're told the Lord had left him. And in verse 21, they gouge out his eyes. This is, of course, going to immediately make us think of Oedipus and the end of Oedipus, and it certainly did Milton, and the blindness of Oedipus, right? And he's grounding grain in a mill in a prison, which is a woman's job. He's being humiliated. And then they have at the very end of the story in chapter 16 the huge party to Dagon, the idol, and 3,000 men and women at verse 27 are going to be slaughtered as Samson will say at verse 28, remember me and let me die with them. And we're told that he killed more people when he pulls down the temple ceiling by pushing down the pillars than he killed in all of his life, and then finally buried in his father's tomb. It's interesting what license, we might say, Milton takes with this story, but it's a significant story for us. He does take liberties, just like Milton took liberties with the Matthew 4, Luke 4, Temptations of Christ story in earlier lectures we talked about. Next, we want to understand Aristotle's poetics if we're going to understand this text. We said you got to know something about Hebrew history, you got to know some Jewish history, you got to know something about the story of Samson. Now we need to know something a little bit about Aristotle's poetics. Now, I've given earlier lectures on Aristotle's poetics, but let's just remind ourselves of what exactly is going on. First of all, there is, for Milton, an opening set of observations of that sort of dramatic poem called Tragedy, that he will present with this play. Tragedy, he says, as it was anciently composed, hath been ever held the gravest, moralist, and most profitable of all other poems, therefore said by Aristotle in his Poetics, to be of power by raising pity and fear or terror, to purge, or catharsis here, the mind of those and such like passions, that is, to temper and reduce them to just measure with a kind of delight, stirred up by reading or seeing those passions well imitated, from Poetics 1449b. Technically, though, Aristotle didn't say passions well imitated, he actually said actions well imitated. We should point out then as well that here there's going to even be some mention by Milton that the Apostle Paul, for example, Apostle Paul himself thought it not unworthy to insert a verse of Euripides into the text of Holy Scripture, 1 Corinthians